you're a dude. You were born in the 80s, maybe the 90s. You're a nerd. You love retro pop culture franchises. You have a soft spot for little toys and figures and collectibles. You love board games. But you're finding it increasingly difficult to carve out the time in your busy life to actually enjoy those things. How do I know all this? Well, A, I just described myself, and B, the channel has had about 1 million views a month for the past 5 years, and YouTube gives me pretty detailed stats on people that watch. So first off, apologies to the 1 in 10 people who I didn't just describe, but hopefully you'll still find this video pretty entertaining. And it looks like there's one woman who was born in the 50s who's watched every single video multiple times. Hi, Mum. My name's Guy, you're watching Midwinter Minis, and I used to like wrestling. Quite a lot. I'm talking about when I was like 6, 7, maybe to 12. So that would be like the golden era into the new generation. And this was also about the same time as I got into Warhammer. Slap bang in the middle of 2nd edition 40k, and honestly, wrestling and Warhammer have a lot in common.
Brother.
Over-the-top violence, conflict-driven narrative, cartoonish characters, warring factions, cheesy catchphrases.
For the Emperor! And that's the bottom line!
Heroes you love to hate, and villains you hate to love, deeply entrenched lore, and massive muscular dudes. I absolutely loved it all. And before you even start, I am 100% straight. I can just appreciate a tall, extremely muscular, ruggedly handsome man covered in baby oil. 99%. While I carried on with Warhammer and eventually kind of made it my job, I left wrestling behind in my childhood. Or so I thought until I watched the Mr. McMahon documentary on Netflix. And while you'd be forgiven for thinking that discovering loads of your childhood icons were actually really horrible people and that the company culture was really stomach turning, yeah, you'd think that would turn me off, but actually, no, I got right back into it. I started binge watching classic matches in the eras I'd missed, bought the video games, completed the video games, and I started watching Raw, but just not at 1 AM because I'm not mad. And obviously I'm not the only one who's been doing this, because TKO, the umbrella company that owns WWE now, their share prices have skyrocketed about 40% since that documentary came out. So here I am now, a nerd who lives and breathes Warhammer, who loves painting tiny figures and playing games with them, but who also has a rekindled passion for professional wrestling. If only there was a way to combine these two interests in a way that was quick to learn, fun to paint, and didn't take 3 hours to play a bloody game. This is Rumbeslam, a tabletop miniature game with I'm not going to describe it because I just did. It's a game, there's minis, they're cool, there's loads of pop culture references, you don't need many of them to play, it's pretty quick to get going, and from the demo games I've played, it seems fun. Which kinda has to be the most important thing, right? It's also really affordable. The 2-player starter box will set you back about 40 quid, and yeah, let me show you what's inside. You've got some markers, some clear acrylic bases, some unique dice, a mouse mat style neoprene wrestling ring with a subtle grid printed on it, cards for all the characters and their stats, the instruction book, which is refreshingly slim, and then there's the minis. Now I know one thing that puts a lot of board game people off getting into something like this that uses miniatures is the prep work required before you even begin, and also painting all the models up if you want that extra immersion. So as a quite experienced modeler and painter and game player, let me hold your hand through that process, and I'm going to keep it super simple for you. So all the Rumbeslam minis are made of resin, which has the upside of insanely crisp details compared to plastic, and all but one of the models are in one piece, so hardly any assembly required. The downside is that resin is a little bit more fragile to work with, and you'll also need to give the models a wash before we start. Warm soapy water and a soft toothbrush will do here. The same mold release they use for the resin miniatures can also stop the paint sticking properly, so let's just give them a gentle scrub first and let that water dry off. You're going to need a pair of nippers for the next step, but in a pinch some nail clippers would do absolutely fine. We're going to be cutting away all of the casting gates, leaving the models behind. Now, before you go chopping the feet straight off the gate, I tend to find it's best to work from the most fragile parts first, cutting close to the contact points. That way you won't flex and possibly break them, which they might end up doing if you cut the big bits first, because you're going to be pushing all the pressure on the small fragile bits. And let's Mazel tov, I guess. Some of the bigger models like the troll have quite large contact points, but you can just nip these away until they're basically flush with the model. Most of the gates and contacts are in really subtle places that you will never really see when you're playing with these models anyway, so don't worry too much about making them perfect. Mr. Pointy here has a gate right on his finger, so you've got to be really careful when clipping this one off. Same goes with these little goblins. They're quite fiddly, but don't worry if you mess up. Even with 30 years of experience doing this, I still accidentally broke off one of the tassels, but no worries, a tiny dab of super glue and it'll be good as new. The models are, by and large, really cleanly cast. They do have some light mold lines on them, but you can easily scrape them away with the blunt side of a hobby knife. And honestly, I'm only bothering with the really obvious top-facing ones here. These are not competition entries, they're game pieces. Now, rather than sticking these straight onto the clear bases and then getting paint all over them, I'd recommend sticking them onto something that's easy to grab, like a cork or a little block of wood, or my favourite option, some little plastic shot glasses. You can get these in bulk for super cheap, and they're really useful for mounting minis, mixing paints and washes, and getting hammered. I've left a link in the description if you want to pick up some of these for your own hobby setup. Now, I'm not wearing these gloves for safety reasons or anything, you don't have to, but my hands are a bit cut up and battered at the moment, so I don't want to inflict that on you right now, so yeah, you're welcome. Now, to mount the models on the bases, I'm going to use a teeny tiny dab of super glue on the soles of the feet, and then place them gently on the base and just hold them in place for a second on those little shot glasses. When the time comes, it'll be really easy to snap these off again, but they should hold really well while we paint them up. The big old troll dude has an arm that needs to be glued on, so do that. You have to use super glue with resin models, by the way. Plastic cement just won't work. Now, this is a totally optional step, but if you're bugged by the tiny gap between the arm and the body on the big troll, you could use something like this modeling putty. Just smush it into the gap, smooth out the area around it with the brush so it's not ugly and bumpy, and yeah. This particular putty is made by AK, but there are a few different brands you can use that basically do the same thing. The reason I use this one is because it's water soluble, so it won't destroy your brushes while you use it. And once that's dry, that's basically all the prep work done. The last thing we need to do before painting is to prime the models. By using a proper primer, it'll give your models what's called a tooth, which is basically a microscopic texture that will help your paint not only stick to the surface of the models in a more uniform way, but also bond to the resin more than just the acrylic paint would, which will stop the paint from rubbing or chipping off over time, which is good because, as I said, these are going to be game pieces and handled on the regular, not just stuck in a display cabinet. Honestly, it doesn't really matter what colour you choose, but if you're not a confident painter, this would probably be the perfect time just to choose 2 different coloured primers and then just spray each team that colour and call it a day. But I'm going to use a pretty neutral colour. Dead Animal Bits, Pete the Wargamer's signature spray from the Colour Forge. I also have a signature spray, it's great. So I just gave each model 2 very light coats of this stuff. The coverage doesn't have to be perfect because none of this colour is ultimately going to be visible. You just don't really want it to be clogging all the details on the models, just enough to help the paint stick. Now, I also like to prime my palette at the same time with the same primer. That way I'm able to tell exactly how the paint will apply to the model, whether it's too thin or thick, that sort of thing.
Oh, the forbidden tortilla.
In terms of paints, for my basic guides, I like to keep things really simple. You won't need loads and loads and loads of paints. I tend to use a basic selection of 14, which in no specific order are a rich brown, a medium green, a bold blue, a warm khaki, a very basic medium grey, a silvery gunmetal, a saturated purple, a rich gold, an eye-popping yellow, a bold red, a black, a white, and 2 washes. A black wash for stuff like armour and weapons, and a brown umber wash for shading stuff that's warmer toned. While the exact paints and brands I've been using have changed and refined a bit, they're basically the same colours I've been recommending in my speed painting videos since 2018. The difference is that in this episode, they're all from the same brand, because this is a kind of final test for the paint set that I'm putting together with TT Combat, which is really exciting, but that's not what this video is about. But if you want to find out when that happens, make sure to subscribe. Let's paint the orky dudes first. The easiest way to start would be the skin. So let's grab our green and get going. Depending on what paint you're using, you'll probably want to thin it a little bit with some water, not so much that it's runny and transparent, something like this. Now just paint this all over the skin of the orcs. You don't have to worry about painting over the singlets or gloves or boots because we're going to paint over those anyway. Just make sure you get into all the recesses and deep bits like the eye sockets and armpits, palms, that sort of stuff. This particular green is really opaque. Green paints tend to be, so one thin coat is enough. But if yours is a little more transparent, don't be afraid to give it a second coat to make the colour more solid. Next, let's paint those singlets using our red. Same as the green, thin it a little bit with water to make it nice and workable, but not so thin that it'll flood the surface and run into the recesses. You'll want to try and be a little bit more careful on the areas where the red borders the green skin, but honestly don't worry too much about it because we can always fix mistakes a bit later with some more green. Now you can use whatever brush size you feel comfortable with. Obviously, I tend to prefer larger brushes because they hold more paint and it stays workable for a bit longer, but you might want to swap out for your tiniest brush to catch the little straps, especially on the Goblin Dude singlets. The official models have black boots and pads, but honestly I reckon white would make them pop a little bit more. So one thing I love about these paints is that they have pretty clear names like white and not, like mountain snow or Santa's chest hair. Now with all white paints, you'll want to thin them a little bit more than you would with other colours because I don't know why, but they tend to dry a little bit streakier and coarser than other paints. So I definitely recommend doing 2 thinner coats for this step. Once you've sorted the pads and the boots, it'd be smart to switch to your detail brush to catch those tassels on the goblins. And I mean, you know what? Just one coat looks absolutely fine. Let's move on to the next colour, and that's our khaki paint. And using that, we're just going to base coat the claws and the teeth. Alright then, now is the perfect time to grab your green again and just carefully fix up any areas you accidentally painted over the skin with either the red, the white or the khaki paints. Just neaten everything up a bit before we get messy. Now I'm going to grab the gunmetal metallic paint and base coat the big belt buckle thing that one of the orcs has, as well as the tiny little earrings that a couple of the models have too. So for base coats, that's the orcs sorted, all just one coat, mind. That's why I love these specific paints, because they save you loads of time. But anyway, let's start base coating the humans. Now you might be thinking, hey Guy, it's a bit rogue of you not to include an obvious skin tone paint on my list of 14, but that's where khaki comes in. It's a fantastic colour that you can modify in so many subtle ways to create a whole range of skin tones. Let me show you. So if you want a kind of rosy, fair complexion, the kind that blondes tend to have, start with your khaki, add a tiny touch of red to warm it up, and then desaturate and lighten it with some white. Check that out. It's pretty decent, right? If you want a more rich, earthy tan, simply add a little bit of brown to that rosy flesh tone that we just mixed up. Perfect for those halfling hobbit dudes. And if you want to go darker still, just add in more of the medium brown you've got. But that slightly desaturated mix that it's going into will push it into a more realistic skin tone colour rather than just brown. Yeah, so that's why I have khaki over set flesh tones, because you can make your own pretty easily. And you obviously don't have to do all of these different skin tones, and if you have a skin tone you like, you obviously just use it. But this is just to show you what you can do with the paints and a little bit of simple mixing. Next up, let's vaguely follow the box art by painting their trunks blue. Not worrying too much about the big open areas, but just try to be a little bit careful when you go along the edges of the blue and the skin. Try to keep as neat as you can. This little halfling looks like a bit of an old timer, huh? So let's give him grey hair with the grey paint. Crazy, huh? Who'd have thought? Also, don't forget that people have eyebrows, usually the same colour as their hair, and all of these models have pretty prominent brows, so just streaking your detail brush along them should be pretty simple and quite effective. Let's make this dude a brunette. Just a simple coat of brown paint. Nice. Now blonde hair is a kind of tricky thing to paint, but no worries, khaki to the rescue once again. Simply mix yellow and khaki in about a 1-to-1 mix, and that should give you a rich but quite subtle undertone of blonde. And don't forget the beard and the eyebrows. There you go. Now for the boots. I think black would honestly be a bit too bold and stark, so instead I'm going to mix black and grey in fairly equal amounts to create a more shadowy, charcoaly colour, and base coat the boots. I reckon it would also be cool to have this guy's vest in black instead of blue. And some of the humans also have wrist guards and gloves too, so yeah, let's just paint those in that black as well. Just one more step and I'd consider them game ready. And that step is the wash stage. I also have a black wash and a brown wash to work with in my speed paint sessions, but rather than just use one or the other, for this project I'm actually going to mix them together in equal parts to create a very dark but warm toned wash that's suitable for everything. And well, just paint it over, literally everything on all the models. The thing I really like about these particular washes is that they act like the now discontinued Citadel gloss shades, and that they really love finding the recesses and actually don't do a huge amount of staining on the flatter surfaces. If you get big pools gathering in certain areas, you want to wick away the excess with a drier brush so you don't get ugly tide marks as the puddles evaporate. And after an hour or two, everything should be dry. One little extra trick you could do is to grab your detail brush, mix up a few more drops of the black and brown wash again, and just recess shade any particular muscles, creases or details you want to really pop. Even over areas that are already dark, because that reinforcement will make them extra dark and stand out even more. And I'm just saying, if you were just wanting to do a super quick basic paint job on your minis, you could call it here. Stick them on the bases. They've got big bold colours, they're really neatly painted, and they've got some quick easy shading, but come on now, you've come this far. I reckon you'll probably be feeling a little bit more confident with your detail brush by now, so let me show you a few quick, simple ways you could really up the contrast and make them stand out in your games. First off, let's grab our white again, thin it down so it's a little bit more transparent than the thickness we used to base coat, and then using the detail brush, just do some sketchy highlights on the orc wristbands and boots, really just focusing on the top facing areas and adding a few gentle strokes to the edges and ridges. Imagine places where the light would catch. Less is more here, I think. So the one on the left is the unhighlighted model, and the one on the right has had the white highlights done. It's very subtle, but it definitely gives it a lift. You can mix a tiny bit of black wash into the white paint as well to tone it down, sort of making like a light grey glaze that you can use to even out any areas where the wash looks a bit too dramatic or dirty. For example, these bits on the elbow pads, they look a little bit mucky, so I'll glaze over the darker areas with this light grey and yeah, much better. To tart up the red singlets, I'm going to mix some yellow into the red to make a kind of blood orange colour, and then just like the white highlights, I'm going to add some streaky little lines on the outward facing and prominent bits, staying way clear of any recesses. Yeah, it looks way better, huh? Same thing with the skin, adding a tiny touch of yellow to the green to make it more sickly, potent colour, but instead of doing little jaggedy strokes that hint at fabric texture, I'm going to use a kind of hatching effect, drawing lots of thin lines in the direction of the muscle fibres, which should really show off each orky wrestler's raw power. Again, stay away from the recesses and put most of your focus on the head, shoulders and arms. Again, the model on the left has no green highlights and the model on the right has had them done. It's night and day, right? It looks so good. A little bright highlight on the tips of the teeth and the claws would make them pop loads, and we can get that right colour by just lightening up some khaki paint with a tiny touch of white. Now you've got the techniques down, you're basically using the same methods for the humans too, it's just the colours that are going to be different. So mixing a bit of white into the blue to make scratchy fabric highlights on the trunks, mixing grey into black to make a subtle highlight for the black boots, vests and gloves, mix yellow and white about 50-50 to create a really pale highlight colour for the blonde hair you have, but honestly don't highlight every strand of hair, that's a trap. Just pick 2 or 3 areas where you want to create the look of a shine and go from side to side like this. Just leave the rest. See, it looks pretty cool, huh? Especially for what, 3 steps? Brown and khaki in a 1-to-1 mix is a great highlight colour for dark skin, but be careful not to place too many highlights, otherwise it'll make the whole thing look too light. You want to keep lots of that rich skin tone we've already got going on very visible. And for the paler skin tones, just mix up that original khaki and white with a tiny touch of red mix we did for the base coats, but lean a little bit more on the white to lighten it up. But after that step, I mean, you're actually done. Give yourself a pat on the back and let's snap these little bad boys off their cups. Short, sharp shock, bam, no problem. Keep it swift and sudden and the feet should just snap off without any breakages. You might want to snip or trim or file off any super glue off their soles, but after that they are ready to glue to the bases. Now, for longer than I care to admit, I thought that I had special fancy clear blue bases, but no. They just have a protective film on one side, which you can peel off with your nail. You can quite easily feel which side has the film because it kind of sticks when you scratch it. If you're struggling to get your nail under the edge, just give it a little poke with a toothpick or the tip of a hobby blade. And a teeny tiny dab of super glue on the soles, and then just plop them down. Facing doesn't really matter on the bases, so you can put them diagonally if you want to. And top tip, if you don't want your bases to fog up from the superglue fumes as they dry, stick them in front of a fan to make sure there's airflow. That way the chemical reaction that causes the hazy residue will be blown away before it can cause it. And there we go, that's the basic dudes from each team of the Rumbeslam starter set, painted up quickly, easily, and if I do say so, looking pretty great. They are such a cool little project for new painters because the models are a tiny bit bigger than Warhammer models, and the details are bigger because of that. And the different parts are all quite easy to reach, no fiddly trim or anything weird. And yes, I haven't forgotten that there are also 2 other massive models, one on each team. And you can obviously paint those up in exactly the same way that I just painted the basic team members, but I feel like they've got some interesting elements that probably make them deserve a video all to themselves. Plus, this video is already getting pretty long. On top of the big model painting video, I'd also quite like to do a simple how to play Rumbeslam video to help people either get a hang of the game if they've already bought it, or just to show people what it's like before they actually make a decision whether or not they want to buy it or not. Honestly, I think it's got pretty good potential because it combines 2 things that I'm personally really interested in. It's apparently really fast paced, it's fun, it's silly, it's a good laugh. So, I mean, it's all ticks so far. So again, obviously subscribe if you don't want to miss those videos when they come out, and also news about the paint set when that comes out, which is extremely exciting, and I've been waiting years to do this, so I am totally hyped. And by the way, those names that you see over there, that is the credits crew tier for our Patreon supporters. There is a small army of absolutely amazingly generous legends who help me make these videos for everyone to watch for free. So I can't thank them enough. And if you want to join them too, you can from just £2 a month. Just follow the link in the description. And I suppose that's it from me. My name's Guy. You've been watching Midwinter Minis. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.